Premier Jason Kenney in Alberta addressing the controversy over one of his ministers, Municipal Affairs Minister Tracy Allard, going to Hawaii over the holidays, despite guidelines and advisories saying non-essential travel outside of Canada should be avoided. We can give you a little more clarification. She left Alberta on the 19th, according to Kenney. He found out about it on Tuesday, the 29th, when everything blew up in Ontario after the finance minister there was ordered to come home from St. Bart's. He said he asked Minister Allard to return to Alberta, and she did indeed come home. I want to go through a little bit of what he said because it appears there was some mixed messaging there. Kenney says the definition of non-essential travel is subjective, and she did not violate any public health sanctions or the law. And ergo, she has apologized. She'll be issuing a statement herself later, but she will not be asked to resign or be fired, as we saw what happened with the Ontario finance minister. He did say that he has now issued a directive. He says it's his own responsibility. He takes responsibility for not having been absolutely clear with his ministers and his political staff that they should be following the guidelines. But he says it's his responsibility for not issuing a directive. He has now issued that directive, and he says he's asking cabinet ministers, staff, people in senior leadership roles to stay home. But again, he goes on to say he cannot sanction people for following all the rules when it comes to travel. And in fact, lots of Albertans are indeed traveling right now, thousands of them. And he says if they weren't able to travel, it would put WestJet out of business and the airline industry in Canada would collapse. So a couple of things to parse there. And to help me walk through that, I'm joined by Lydia Miljan. She's a political science professor at the University of Windsor. Professor, let me ask you your take on what the Premier of Alberta had to say.
I am so confused now. I think for some of us living in different parts of the country, it really does now feel like there are different rules depending on where you live. And when we've heard about, the Atlantic bubble and we've heard about stay-at-home orders in places such as Ontario being in gray zones. But now it's news to me that Alberta actually has a very different policy, that even though they had suggested that people stay home, it wasn't a order. And so, in fact, none of these people had broken any firm directives. And in fact, at the same time, he's saying that they wanted to encourage travel, safe travel, responsible travel, to ensure that organizations such as WestJet keep their doors open. So we're in very uncharted territories when you have different parts of the very same country having these very changing goalposts, if it were.
Right. And so, again, if there is mixed messaging, what impetus is there for the public to change their mindset when it comes to travel, even though there is a global advisory that non-essential travel should not be taking place right now? And I don't necessarily think that's subjective, Lydia. I think that's pretty clear. Don't vacation. If you have to cross the border, our borders are open for essential travel. But there are lots of people who would love to take a vacation or visit family members. I haven't seen my stepkids in over a year, Lydia, because they live in the United States. But
oh, I'm with you on that. I mean, I'd love to travel to Alberta, but I thought I wasn't allowed to visit my family.
Right.
I think the issue here, and this is the problem with basically what's been going on with this entire pandemic, is that different provinces have different rules. The federal government hasn't really made clear what sort of the defining line is. They have allowed the provinces to make these different rules. And then you have these new arrangements that, in fact, such as Alberta, they're saying we want to encourage responsible travel. There's agreements with Hawaii, for example, and that sort of explains why you had those pictures from staffers from Hawaii. They actually didn't do anything wrong from that province. Whereas in Ontario, we know that we are in a lockdown situation until the end of January. And I think that is the problem throughout this pandemic, is that there's been these differing rules. And then people, I think our natural inclination is to say, well, the rules don't apply to me, or they're trying to find loopholes. And so what this has shown us is that there are some pretty major loopholes when it comes to travel. And I think that we've seen that over the holidays. The fact that thousands of Canadians and people around the world are traveling, it is quite shocking for those of us who thought that the rules were stay at home. So I guess for me, the issue is that we don't have one single rule for everybody. It does depend on on where you live. It depends, I guess, on the severity of the outbreaks in those regions.
Mhm.
And that's how you get mixed messages, because we can hear about what's happening in different provinces. And so it's very difficult to hold on to what are the rules for me in my jurisdiction when I hear about what's happening for other people.
So I do think there are two separate issues here at play. And I do, to be fair to Premier Kenney, he tried to sort of walk that line, right? But it ended up walking in circles, it appeared. So there's people who want to travel, and then there are government officials, our public elected officials, who are supposed to be setting an example. So he has issued a directive where, senior leadership, cabinet ministers, MLAs should know better and not travel for non-essential purposes, to set an example. So do you agree with
Yeah,
that
that's
line?
where he lost me. I was almost going with him when he said, these people didn't do anything wrong. We don't have any public health orders to suggest that they shouldn't travel. And in fact, we're encouraging travel. I thought, okay, fair enough. That's where this is going to go. And then he changes. He says, but at the same time, I should have offered a directive so that they shouldn't travel. So in a sense, I want to say to Premier Kenney, pick a lane.
Yeah.
Either you want safe travel or you don't. Don't have a separate rules, either lenient or more stringent for public officials. Decide what the plan is and then let everybody get along with it, because now it's going to be even more confusing, I think, for people in Alberta and people for the rest of the country.